Hello. Before we begin, let me say this carefully. What you're about to hear wasn't planned as a public conversation, not because it's classified, not because it's forbidden, but because when facts don't line up cleanly, institutions tend to wait, and waiting creates silence. Tonight, we're going to sit inside that silence, not to accuse, not to speculate wildly, but to notice something that has been noticed quietly by a lot of very serious people. A visitor called 3-Eye Atlas, and the uncomfortable questions that formed around it before anyone decided what to say out loud.
I want to slow this down right away, because when people hear the word visitor, they think science fiction. That's not what this is. 3-Eye Atlas is real. Observed, tracked, logged, detected by multiple instruments. No debate there. The debate begins with how it behaved, when it was noticed, and how long it took for anyone to speak plainly about what didn't quite fit.
Exactly. And we're not here to tell people what to think. We're here to ask why certain things were framed one way, while other things were barely framed at all. This object didn't just appear in a telescope image. It arrived in a system already watching the sky very carefully, and yet the early language around it was restrained, almost cautious.
Let's talk about timing, not conclusions, just timing. The detection window, the confirmation process, the follow-up observations. None of that is unusual by itself, but when you lay it out end to end, there's a rhythm to it, a pause, then a release, then another pause, as if people were waiting for something before saying anything more.
And that something was never clearly named, which is important, because in science, when data fits expectations, communication is fast, efficient, confident. Here, the communication was careful. Words like consistent with, likely, still under analysis. All technically correct, but noticeably incomplete.
One astronomer we spoke to off-record used a phrase that stuck with me. They said, it wasn't alarming, it was distracting. That's an odd word to use for an object moving through interstellar space. Distracting from what?
Or distracting because of what it forced people to double-check. Motion, brightness, repetition in observation logs. Again, none of this proves anything, but repetition matters, especially when instruments in different locations begin to report patterns that require extra footnotes.
Let's be precise here. Patterns don't mean intent. Patterns don't mean design. Sometimes patterns just mean we don't yet understand the environment fully. But what raised eyebrows wasn't the existence of anomalies. It was how consistently they were described without being explored publicly.
There's also the question of listening, not looking, listening. Radio observations were conducted. That's standard, responsible, expected. What's interesting is how little detail was shared about what those observations ruled out versus what they simply couldn't resolve yet.
And when institutions don't resolve something, they usually say so directly. We don't know yet. In this case, the language leaned more toward closure than uncertainty, as if the door was gently shut while a few notes were still on the table.
Which brings us to what's missing. No dramatic statements, no emergency briefings, but also no deep public walkthrough of the strange bits, the ones that required extra calibration, extra confirmation, extra internal discussion.
I want to pause here because this is where people jump ahead. We're not saying information is being hidden. We're saying information was handled conservatively, and conservatism in science often signals sensitivity, not secrecy.
Or caution about interpretation, especially when an object doesn't behave exactly like the last 10 objects that passed through. Especially when it's labeled interstellar, not as a metaphor, but as a measured fact.
Here's the part that reframed this for me. A researcher said, we weren't worried about what it was, we were worried about being wrong too quickly. That suggests internal disagreement, not about danger, but about certainty.
And disagreement slows narratives. It fragments messaging. It creates those quiet gaps where nothing is said, not because there's nothing to say, but because there's too much to say responsibly.
So, as part 1 comes to a close, let's leave the audience with this thought. If 3i Atlas had behaved exactly as expected, we wouldn't be talking like this. The story would already feel finished.
But it doesn't. And that's not because of what we know. It's because of what was carefully not emphasized. The pauses, the restrained language, the sense that conclusions arrived slightly ahead of explanations. And once you notice that, you start wondering what the next data release was meant to confirm, or finally put to rest.
And that question doesn't disappear when the charts fade from the screen.
It follows the object as it moves on. When we return to this conversation, we have to resist the urge to fill in the gaps ourselves, because the gaps are the story. What happened after the initial analyses were completed is just as telling as what happened before.
Right, because follow-up doesn't always mean discovery. Sometimes it means reassurance, internal reassurance, and when reassurance is successful, institutions move on quietly. When it isn't, they slow down.
What's notable is how many independent teams continued to observe 3i Atlas long after public attention drifted. That's not unusual, but it is selective. Time is expensive. Telescope access is competitive. You don't keep looking unless there's a reason.
And yet, the public-facing narrative remained narrow, stable, calm, almost final, while the background work continued with careful persistence.
There's also the matter of comparison. This wasn't the first interstellar object detected, but the internal checklists were longer this time, the cross-referencing deeper. That suggests learning, or caution born from previous surprises.
I want to read a line from a technical summary stripped of jargon. It essentially says, this behavior is not inconsistent with natural explanations. That's true, but notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say fully consistent. That difference matters to scientists.
Because not inconsistent is a holding position. It buys time. It avoids overreach. It's the language you use when you're not ready to close the file.
And files that aren't closed tend to resurface.
Quietly.
We asked whether there would be more data released. The answer was polite, vague, as analysis continues. No timeline, no emphasis, just enough to acknowledge the question without inviting follow-ups.
Which brings us back to the feeling that opened this episode, discomfort. Not fear, not excitement, discomfort with premature certainty.
The audience deserves to understand that science doesn't always move in press releases. Sometimes it moves in internal emails, delayed reviews, and meetings that end without conclusions.
And sometimes, years later, someone revisits an object like 3i Atlas and realizes the questions weren't answered because the tools weren't ready yet.
Or because the implications were broader than the data alone could support at the time.
So where does that leave us?
It leaves us watching, not for revelations, but for changes in tone, in language, in what future papers choose to emphasize or quietly reference in passing.
Because the most important stories in science rarely announce themselves as mysteries. They announce themselves as footnotes that don't quite resolve.
And 3i Atlas is still moving.
Out of focus, but not out of the conversation. We'll end this episode the same way it began. Carefully. What you've heard tonight isn't a conclusion. It's a record of unease, the kind that tells researchers to keep listening even when the signal fades. And if this object taught us anything, it's that some stories don't end when the data stops coming in. They end when we finally understand why we hesitated to speak in the first place. And that moment hasn't arrived yet.